I'm incredibly honored to be here today with the source of my inspiration so much, which is Judy Schills. I think, she talks a lot about the importance of mentors, and it's important to see in the world that you are in who your heroes are. Because heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and they can be in unexpected places. And not that Judy is an unusual shape, size, or place. She's exactly where I would think she would be. The unexpected thing about Judy is her phenomenal capacity for dreaming and believing in change. It's just, you are such an inspiration, Judy, and thank you so much for putting this on. You're amazing in my life, so thank you. So I'm going to spend my 10-12 minutes. I want to give you a little sense of my journey, because when I was an undergrad at UC Berkeley, I would have had no clue. Well, first of all, I would never have known what the Department of Toxic Substance Control was, or that I would have any interest in working at a place with a name like that. But I did know one thing about myself, and that is that I was passionate about science, that I loved science. So I was a bio major. Then I realized I didn't like things that complained or bled, so I didn't want to go to medical school, so I became a botanist, because plants don't yell or scream when you hurt them, at least not that we can hear. But my childhood turned out to be very formative in ways that I didn't understand until later on, and I want to share some of the lessons I learned because they colored who I am, and they've colored the work that I've done. So I grew up in Southern California. I'm the daughter of a physicist. And so our conversations around the dinner table were all about arms control and physics and things that I couldn't even pronounce. But one of the messages that I got early on is the power of science and the understanding and the belief that all problems could be solved if we just put our intellectual minds to them, and if science could take a look at them, we would get the answers. So I grew up with a very strong belief in the power of science. I also understood from my father, who was a researcher at UCLA, that it mattered deeply what question you asked. That if you wanted to solve challenging problems, you had to start with the right question. Because if you asked the wrong question, you actually would go in a path that didn't lead you to where you needed to go ultimately. And I'm going to come back to that lesson because it's in fact now influenced everything I do. And it's at the very heart of the most groundbreaking legislation that I'm working on right now for the state of California that the entire world is watching. And so that little kernel, I had no idea how important that kernel was going to be for me. So, my father's daughter, I was going to be a professor just like him. I went straight from undergrad to grad school. I was going to study plant physiology and be a professor. And I realized about 3 years into it that I was really unhappy and that I didn't want to do research and that I love science, but I wanted science to change the world, and I was way too impatient to be in research. Because when you're in research, you work so long and so hard, and there's no guarantee that you get the answer or make the breakthrough. And that just wasn't for my personality. So I left. I'm all but dissertation on my PhD. It was the hardest decision of my entire life. I literally cried for 2 years. Literally cried for 2 years because I started life so sure where I was going to go, and I realized it wasn't the right path. And so that allowed me, making that hardest decision, forced me and allowed me to say, well, what's next? Where am I going? And so I taught high school. I worked at the Exploratorium, which is a science museum in San Francisco. I had 2 babies, moved to Southern California, and then just did informational interviews, trying to find out what I was going to do, and discovered the perfect place for me. And I would never have known it starting out, and that's government. So for me, I found that the most effective place for my talents and my beliefs is working in government. That's where I can use science to change the world. I would have had no idea when I was an undergrad that was where I was going to end up. But it's been the most rewarding journey I could ever imagine. And what I came to understand very early on in my government career was actually science doesn't have all the answers. And that if we wait for science to prove cause and effect, we've actually waited too long most of the time. Because science moves slowly. And science only answers the questions that are being asked. So if you're not asking the question, nobody's looking for the answers. So for example, there are about 80,000 chemicals in commerce right now. Science only knows a suite of information about 10% of them. So if we use science as our decision-making tool, only as our decision-making tool, to decide what is a safe chemical, then actually we get lead in gasoline. We get asbestos for years and years and years. We get tobacco in cigarettes. Because those who want to keep selling those chemicals, those products, will use science against us. Because they'll say, you can't prove that that cigarette caused cancer. You can't prove that the lead in gasoline is hurting IQ. You can't prove on and on and on, right? And so that kind of realization that while science was critical and important, if we stopped there, we would be harming the earth and our bodies irreparably. And in fact, that is what we've been doing. So I'm not anti-science. In fact, I'm very proud of science and the way it helps. I understand its limitations, and I understand how it can be misused. So that important lesson of my childhood, it's critical to ask the right question when you're seeking answers to difficult problems. I want to talk a little bit about how that is evolving. So when I say you can find your heroes or your mentors in odd places, I was at a conference, an environmental conference in Minnesota, and this logger from Libby, Montana, I don't know, why is the logger a keynote speaker? He changed my life. The things he said two things I'm going to share with you today that absolutely changed my life. The first is this. He said, people will follow those who lead. If you don't have a vision, all you have is a fight. If you don't have a vision, all you have is a fight. That becomes very important in the environmental movement because so often what we have are only fights. Don't use plastic. Don't drive. Don't do this. There's no vision in that, right? That's just a fight. Is it okay to use pesticides? Is it okay to use lead in lipstick? Those are important things, but they aren't visions. What we need is a vision. People will follow visions. Otherwise, the fight just gets exhausting. And I want you to think about that as you think about how you're going to frame the change you want. If you stick with the fight, it's actually fairly limiting in terms of behavior change. So for me, what is that vision? For me, that vision came in a concept that is called the precautionary principle, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it today, but I'm just going to say that that was one of the things that I worked on in San Francisco. We became the first city in the country to adopt the precautionary principle as a fundamental decision-making tool. We took our lead from Europe. We didn't invent it, but we took our lead from Europe. And what the precautionary approach does is it mandates a certain question. And this gets back to that theme, that lesson of it's all about the question you ask. And this is what it does. This is the nutshell. If you take nothing away, I hope you take this away from my words today. It is not sufficient to ask the question, is it safe? Or is it legal? Is it legal to smoke cigarettes? Is it legal to put formaldehyde in the carpet adhesive? You bet it is. Is it legal to put lead in lipstick? Yes. Is it legal to put endocrine disruptors in baby bottles? Yes. That's not a sufficient question anymore, and we know that in the room. It is also no longer sufficient to ask the question, is it safe? Is it safe to put an endocrine disruptor in a baby bottle? Is it safe for us to have formaldehyde in the carpet adhesive? Because the problem with that question is it depends who you ask. If you ask the people who make it, or a certain set of scientists, they'll give you their 2 feet thick of science saying, yes, it's perfectly safe, don't worry about it. The levels are too small to make a difference. If you ask someone else, they'll show you 2 feet thick of science saying it's not safe. So the only answer to that question, is it safe, is more study. More study. Well, you can't prove it, right? You're just going to have to study it farther, which means no action. Instead, the key question for me, and in the work I do, is it necessary? Is it necessary to make a carpet adhesive with formaldehyde in it? Is it necessary to put lead in lipstick? Is it necessary to put formaldehyde in nail polish? You know, the list goes on and on. That question you can answer. That question you can actually answer today. And that question is actually visionary, because that question involves all sorts of people coming together to find the answer. The chemists, the product designers, the people like us who are consumers, we all help answer that question. It's a very powerful question and very scary to the manufacturers who would rather us not ask it. Because if we stay with is it legal and is it safe, they get to keep business as usual. When we ask, is it necessary, change happens. And we have lots of examples of that. So what am I working on now? On Halloween, we launched something that I didn't want to launch it on Halloween, but that's just when it came out. I'm incredibly proud of. The state of California is doing something called a Green Chemistry Initiative. We launched our Safer Consumer Product Regulations. This is leading regulations in the world. So again, Europe is doing great stuff, Canada's doing great stuff. Can't say so for the United States government, but in California we don't wait for that. And in the state of California, we have a law on the books now and regulations that I have worked with my team to develop that force a question. They mandate a question, but they do not dictate an answer. And what they will do is they will mandate that manufacturers who put toxic chemicals in their consumer products are going to have to ask the question, is it necessary? And they're going to have to answer that question to us, the state of California. And they're going to have to look at what those safer alternatives are and choose the alternative that minimizes harm. And if they don't, if the answer is it is necessary, they have to keep doing it, then we have a whole bunch of options. We call them regulatory responses. We could say, you know what, we don't believe it. Other people have changed it. You have 2 years and we're banning it. We could say, you know what, you are going to have to notify everyone you sell to that that product contains that chemical. Or the problem is the end of life, like mercury and fluorescent lights, you have to do a take-back program. So we have a whole suite of options now in the state of California to force manufacturers to answer the question, is it necessary? So this logger from Libby, Montana, the second thing he said that has become my personal mantra is the world is run by those who show up. The world is run by those who show up. I really believe that. I have seen it. It is the most powerful thing for you to come away with. And you have already started showing up because you're here. There are so many ways to show up. So many ways. You can be like me in government. You can be a researcher. You can work like Judy does in the nonprofit world. You can show up in your campuses like you're already doing. But the key is to show up. When Judy called her friend and said, why is Purell there? She was showing up. When you vote for the first time, that's showing up. There are so many ways, but that's how the world is run. And so that's what I want to leave you with today, is ask the right question and show up. Thank you.